It was the 14th of October in the year 1943, situated approximately 25,000 feet above the German heartland. Staff Sergeant Michael Romano was jammed deep within the narrow confines of his B-70's tail section, his knuckles white as he gripped the twin 50-caliber machine guns, weapons that frankly outweighed the man holding them. Peering through the tiny curved plexiglass viewport, he tracked a Focke-Wulf 190, beginning its menacing approach. The angle was critical, 6 o'clock low, which every bomber crew knew was the most brutally exposed position. Romano squinted, trying to align the rudimentary aiming apparatus, a mere ring and bead sight, effectively 2 metal posts, onto his rapidly closing adversary. This antique targeting mechanism provided absolutely zero assistance in compensating for speed, no calculation for the necessary deflection, and offered no support whatsoever as both metal beasts hurtled through the upper atmosphere at a combined closing speed easily surpassing 500 miles per hour. He squeezed the triggers. Bright tracers streaked out, arcing hopelessly wide and behind the descending fighter. Then came the response. The FW-190's cannons spat fire. 20mm shells ripped through the bomber's aluminum skin as effortlessly as tearing fine tissue paper. This brutal exchange repeated itself 291 times across the infamous 2nd Schweinfurt operation that very day. The mighty 8th Air Force had committed 291 B-17 flying fortresses deep into Reich territory foolishly, without any friendly fighter escort whatsoever. By the descent of night, 60 of those magnificent bombers, representing well over 20% of the initial striking force, would be irretrievably lost. Another 138 limped back to England, damaged so severely they would never fly again. 600 American airmen would be counted among the dead. The resultant mathematics were cold, unforgiving, and fundamentally unsustainable for the war effort. At this appalling attrition rate, the statistical probability suggested that no single bomber crew would ever survive their mandated 25 operational missions. Post-mission debriefings laid bare the horrifying reality. The tail gunners, theoretically the final barrier against the favored German attack vector, were documenting confirmed hit rates hovering below 8%. Luftwaffe fighter pilots simply needed to approach from the rear, endure a few agonizing seconds of inaccurate return fire, and then methodically dismantle America's multi-billion-dollar strategic daylight bombing campaign, one fortress at a time. Senior leadership convened at the 8th Air Force Command Center in High Wycombe, England, facing an existential crisis. The defensive weaponry, the very arsenal supposed to render the B-17 an impregnable flying fortress, had failed spectacularly. Without an urgent technological breakthrough, the entire doctrine of precision daylight bombing faced imminent cancellation. What those assembled commanders failed to grasp was that at that precise moment, parked on a desolate, cold concrete dispersal pan at Bassingbourn Airfield, a 22-year-old tail gunner possessing little more than a high school diploma was meticulously sketching a device in his personal logbook, a device that contravened numerous Army Air Force's technical orders, a concept that would be immediately dismissed as mechanically unfeasible by seasoned weapons engineers. A design destined to potentially triple tail gun accuracy and salvage countless American lives. This is the narrative of the unauthorized innovation they desperately tried to suppress, and the gunner who possessed the stubborn refusal to accept failure. To fully appreciate the revolutionary nature of Romano's breakthrough, one must first grasp the sheer impossibility of the tactical predicament facing tail gunners throughout 1943. The B-17 Flying Fortress entered the European theater operating under a defensive ethos largely adapted from antiquated naval combat doctrine. Intricately covered with an abundance of machine guns designed to create overlapping fields of fire, the bombers were theoretically designed to defend themselves through the sheer overwhelming volume of lead they could dispense. The Army Air Force's glossy promotional literature touted it as a flying battleship. The brutal reality in the skies above Germany suggested something far more fragile. Staff Sergeant Michael Romano arrived at Bassingbourn Airfield in August of 1943, assigned as a replacement tail gunner to the legendary 91st Bomb Group. He hailed from the industrial grit of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He possessed no university credentials, no formal background in mechanics or engineering, and was barely 19 years old when he voluntarily enlisted. The military processed him through 6 weeks of rigorous training, focused on clearing weapon jams, making rudimentary range estimations, and implicitly learning how to pray his shots actually connected with something substantial. His assigned station, the tail gun position, offered a claustrophobic space marginally larger than a wooden coffin. He was required to kneel upon a bicycle seat, his feet wedged firmly against structural elements of the aircraft, his arms maneuvering the dual 84B Browning M2 heavy machine guns within a field of fire so restricted it felt criminal. The heavy weapons swiveled upon a decidedly basic yoke mount. His aiming apparatus consisted solely of that ring and bead sight, a metallic circle paired with a front post reminiscent of sights found on rifles from the American frontier era. To successfully engage a fighter making a high-speed dive, Romano was forced to intuitively gauge the target's velocity relative to his own rapidly moving platform. He had to mentally calculate the necessary deflection angle, precisely where to aim ahead of the moving fighter, and simultaneously compensate for the inevitable bullet drop over the distance involved. Furthermore, he had to execute these complex split-second calculations while encased in bulky insulated gloves battling temperatures dipping to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. All this while trying to land hits before the opposing Luftwaffe pilots, utilizing cannons with 4 times the effective range, could reduce his position to flying shrapnel. Even expert gunners trained in peacetime aerial combat schools attempting the exact same maneuvers under perfectly controlled conditions managed hit rates barely inching above 12%. In the chaos of combat, stress-starved of oxygen and under murderous fire, actual confirmed hit rates routinely collapsed down to 6 or a disastrous 8%. The Luftwaffe command recognized this inherent design weakness with alarming speed. German fighter tactics rapidly evolved throughout 1943. Their standard operating procedure became the attack from the 6 o'clock level or low aspect, accepting the minimal hazard posed by 20 seconds of erratic tailfire at close to 200 yards before unleashing the devastating punch of their 20mm ordnance. After-action reports originating from the Luftwaffe explicitly characterized the B-17 tail stations as presenting only a marginally acceptable risk, deeming the defensive accuracy wholly insufficient to effectively deter their aggressive attacks. The casualty ledger spoke volumes. August 17, 1943, the initial Schweinfurt mission, 60 bombers downed. October 8, 1943, the raid on Brunswick, 30 bombers lost. October 10, 1943, the Munster sortie, another 30 bombers eliminated. The 8th Air Force was hemorrhaging bombers at a rate that exceeded the capacity of American factories to manufacture replacements. General Henry Hap Arnold, the commanding general of the entire Army Air Forces, upon reviewing these shocking casualty figures in Washington, D.C., began openly questioning the overall viability of the entire daylight bombing strategy. Engineers proposed conventional answers, more guns, larger caliber ammunition, perhaps electrically powered turrets. Boeing's specialized Cheyenne Modification Center initiated the design process for an updated tail turret, but projected timelines stretched well into 1944. Prototypes of powered turrets did exist, certainly, but installing them required the complete removal and replacement of the entire tail section, a massive factory overhaul requiring months and impossibility to implement on the hundreds of bombers already stationed in Britain. Meanwhile, American airmen continued to perish. Michael Romano flew his very first operational combat sortie on August 19, 1943, targeting the Gilsregen airfield in the Netherlands. He expended 480 rounds against 3 aggressively attacking FW-190s. He felt certain he scored hits. However, the subsequent review of gun camera film later confirmed that every single tracer projectile sailed wide, failing to connect. The enemy fighters ultimately destroyed 2 of the bombers in his immediate formation. Following his 3rd mission, Romano chose not to join his crewmates relaxing post-flight. Instead, he remained on the concrete dispersal pan staring intently at his assigned weapons. His hands trembled not from lingering fear, but from the sheer physical agony of wrestling 84-pound weapons through sustained periods of firing while simultaneously kneeling at sub-zero cruising altitudes. That very night, sitting in his cramped bunk, he committed his initial design concepts to paper. The fundamental flaw he deduced was not the physical design of the Browning machine gun itself. It wasn't even the simplistic mounting mechanism. The core problem was that the tail gunner was effectively firing blind, forced to blindly chase targets he could not accurately track, aiming at an ephemeral point in the sky that he could never precisely predict. What Staff Sergeant Romano urgently required was a tool the Army Air Forces had conspicuously failed to furnish a visual confirmation of where his stream of bullets would actually intersect the target before he committed to pulling the trigger. He desperately needed a reflector sight. However, the severe spatial limitations of the tail position rendered the installation of any conventional reflector sight utterly impossible unless someone was willing to flagrantly disregard established military protocols. Staff Sergeant Michael Romano, it must be noted, possessed precisely 0 accredited qualifications in the field of weapons engineering. Born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1924, Romano had dropped out of high school at age 16 to labor in the steel mills to support his family during his father's debilitating illness. He operated massive blast furnaces, repaired complex industrial machinery, and absorbed practical metallurgy through sheer grinding trial and error, not from any academic textbook. When the United States officially entered the global conflict, he enlisted in the Army Air Forces, motivated primarily by a desire to escape the crushing drudgery of factory labor. The military, based purely on physical suitability, slotted him into aerial gunnery school, not due to any discernible natural aptitude, but because his physical dimensions allowed him to physically contort into the rear defensive position. Standing 5 feet 7 inches tall, weighing 145 pounds, Romano could squeeze into spaces that automatically disqualified larger recruits. He completed the basic gunnery curriculum at Harlingen, Texas, achieving only middling scores on the range qualification exercises. His instructors noted satisfactory trigger discipline and acceptable performance in routine weapons maintenance. In short, no one identified him as a budding genius. He earned his silver gunner wings and was slotted into a B-17 crew as an easily replaceable component within the massive grinding machine that was the 8th Air Force. Yet Romano harbored one crucial characteristic that his official service record utterly failed to capture: an absolute inability to tolerate systems that demonstrably did not function correctly. After his 5th combat sortie on October 4, 1943, targeting Frankfurt, Romano's deep-seated frustration boiled over into genuine crisis. His bomber returned bearing 78 distinct holes from flak impacts and visible structural damage from 2 separate fighter passes. Romano himself had fired 620 rounds of ammunition. He believed with painful certainty that he had not scored a single meaningful hit. Worse still, his closest comrade, the tail gunner aboard an adjacent B-17, had been killed instantly when a menacing Bf-190 attacked directly from the stern, and Romano's desperate retaliatory fire had failed utterly to deter the aggressive attack. That evening, Romano marched out to the aircraft revetment carrying a maintenance flashlight tucked beside his personal logbook. He climbed back into the tail cone of his fortress, which still reeked faintly of spent cordite and leaking hydraulic fluid, and fixed his gaze upon the offensive ring and bead sight. The moment of crystalline insight struck him not as some sudden cinematic epiphany, but as a simple, almost mundane observation. Romano noticed his own faint reflection cast upon the curved, polished plexiglass window. In that distorted mirror image, he could perceive angles extending behind the aircraft's tail section perspectives that the fixed, inadequate ring and bead sight could never cover. He began sketching with furious intensity. What if small, carefully angled mirrors were strategically positioned around the sight aperture, granting him vital peripheral awareness beyond the extremely narrow viewing field of the iron sight? What if those mirrors were angled precisely to display the distinct tracer paths emanating from his own machine guns, allowing him to walk his fire onto a target by monitoring the reflected light pattern rather than straining through those frustratingly inaccurate iron sights? Then came the pivotal genius leap. What if he successfully merged this auxiliary mirror concept with a basic reflector sight, a piece of specialized glass etched with an aiming reticle positioned to permit him to track the enemy aircraft while simultaneously observing them, developing tracer patterns through the peripheral mirror array. It wasn't a complex gyroscopically stabilized computing gun sight, like the high-tech units utilized in dedicated fighter aircraft. No, this was a hybrid assembly of scavenged reflective surfaces and cleverly positioned improvised aiming references. But crucially, it might actually function under combat stress. Romano dedicated 3 full hours that night to drafting elaborate blueprints, calculating precise angular relationships, and mapping out sightlines using a carpenter's protractor he had managed to borrow from the base machine shop. By the time the dawn light began to gray, the horizon he possessed detailed schematics for a mirror-assisted reflector sight system. Remarkably, the design required zero-powered components, demanded no specialized factory installation procedures, and necessitated no complex modification to the existing airframe structure. He also possessed a severe immediate problem. His blueprint explicitly violated Army Air Force's Technical Order ZUN-20 EG-2, which strictly prohibited any form of unauthorized modification to critical defensive armament. If this assembly were discovered installed without explicit authorization, the consequences ranged from severe reprimand to a full court-martial proceedings. Romano, steeling his resolve, decided with cold clarity that he genuinely did not care about the regulation. Romano located his indispensable accomplice in a place unexpected: the base sheet metal fabrication shop. Technical Sergeant Frank Kellerman, a 38-year-old aircraft mechanic from the hard-bitten industrial belt of Detroit, had spent significant time during the Depression years working with the Civilian Conservation Corps, constructing vital infrastructure like bridges and repairing equipment using whatever scrap materials he could creatively source. When Romano approached him on the 7th of October, carrying the logbook sketches and a tentative request for strictly off-the-books fabrication work, Kellerman examined the complex drawings for less than 5 minutes. This, Kellerman stated flatly, without preamble, is unequivocally illegal, Sergeant. Romano simply nodded once, maintaining rigid military posture. Yes, Sergeant. You would be modifying defensive armament without any authorized engineering approval, violating approximately 6 separate technical directives simultaneously. Kellerman glanced up from the intricate sketches, his expression unreadable. When is your next flight scheduled? Tomorrow morning, Romano confirmed. Minster. Then Kellerman concluded, we'd best move with haste. They initiated the clandestine construction process. After midnight, sequestered in a rarely used corner of the main maintenance hangar, relying entirely on materials Kellerman had already unofficially requisitioned through various supply channels. The primary structural components were fabricated from salvaged aircraft remnants, curved mirrors, painstakingly extracted from shattered navigation equipment, sheets of clear plexiglass harvested from the sections of cracked canopy domes, and rigid aluminum brackets cannibalized from airframes already tagged for write-off. The reflector sight itself, the absolute linchpin of the entire system, was stripped from a severely damaged P-47 Thunderbolt fighter resting in the salvage yard. Kellerman expertly extracted the undamaged gun sight assembly originally intended for nose mounting on the fighter, and then began the arduous process of reverse engineering the mounting brackets to fit the impossibly restrictive confines of the B-17 tailgunner's station. The auxiliary mirror system proved significantly more difficult to finalize. Romano insisted on 3 small, precisely curved convex mirrors positioned at specific angles that would grant him the necessary panoramic awareness of his tracer stream paths without obstructing his direct forward view. Kellerman fabricated adjustable mounting rigs using thin sheets of scrap aluminum and ingenious ball socket joints taken from non-essential flight control linkages. They labored through the entire night, continuously test-fitting components, meticulously checking sightlines, and making minute, frustrating adjustments to the mirror angles. At 4:30 in the morning, Kellerman completed the crude installation in Romano's assigned aircraft, the B-17G, designated knockout dropper. While the rest of the flight line remained silent in sleep, the entire modification was a masterpiece of necessity, not engineering elegance. Brackets were secured using standard, easily accessible aircraft bolts. The mirrors themselves were painstakingly affixed using safety wire, the ultimate field expediency. The reflector sight was attached to the gun yoke via a crudely welded bracket that would have instantly sent any qualified Boeing production engineer into a state of immediate apoplexy. Absolutely no mention of this intrusive modification appeared anywhere in the aircraft's official maintenance record log. At the dawn mission briefing, Staff Sergeant Romano uttered not a single word regarding the sophisticated, albeit illegal hardware now installed in his station. His pilot, Lieutenant James Holbrook, conducted a cursory pre-flight check and certainly did not delve into the tail section before they taxied out. The squadron armament officer remained completely unaware. They launched toward Münster precisely at 0730 hours. Over hostile German territory at 10:15 hours, the inevitable happened. A Bf-190 commenced its determined attack run approaching from 6 o'clock low and gaining speed alarmingly fast. Romano deftly maneuvered his guns, his eyes locking onto the illuminated aiming reticle that now floated perfectly superimposed over the enemy aircraft in his new reflector sight. In his newly gained peripheral awareness, the mirrors provided instant visual confirmation of his gun barrel's precise alignment relative to his aim point. He squeezed the trigger for a controlled 3-second burst. The resulting tracer pattern, clearly visible in the mirror display, immediately showed him he was firing fractionally behind the target. With almost no conscious effort, he shifted his aim slightly forward, leading the fighter by the exact diameter of the reticle. He fired again, a slightly shorter burst. This time the visual convergence was undeniable. The tracers and the enemy fighter met. The Bf-190's port engine erupted in an angry gout of flame. The fighter violently broke formation, rolling inverted and spiraling downward in a column of thick black smoke. Romano stared momentarily at his weapon controls, then at the mirrors, and finally back at the now empty sky where the aircraft had been only seconds before. A single breathy word escaped his oxygen mask. Holy, it worked. He returned to Bassingbourn at 1340 hours, logging one confirmed enemy kill, his very first. The ensuing celebration, however, lasted precisely 20 minutes. At 1400 hours during the mandated routine post-flight inspection process, Crew Chief Master Sergeant Donald Pierce spotted the unauthorized hardware nestled in the tail compartment. Pierce, adhering strictly to protocol, immediately reported his discovery to the squadron armament officer Captain Richard Voss, who arrived at the dispersal pan shortly thereafter, clipboard in hand, and an expression of barely contained professional outrage etched onto his face. Sergeant Romano Voss stated, his voice painfully modulated with rigid military discipline. Would you care to offer an explanation for the unauthorized equipment that has been illegally affixed to your defensive position? Romano snapped to attention. Sir, I implemented an improved sighting solution. You installed what? Voss's volume instantly escalated. Do you possess even a rudimentary understanding of the codified regulations? You have just shattered technical order. 0120 EG2 explicitly forbids any form of unauthorized modification to combat defensive armament. This is not a souped-up automobile you are tinkering with in your backyard, Sergeant. This is a complex combat asset. Unapproved alterations can compromise structural integrity, introduce catastrophic fire hazards, and critically interfere with other vital onboard systems. Sir, the system performs, Romano replied firmly. I achieved a confirmed enemy aerial victory today. I do not care if you single-handedly annihilated the entire Luftwaffe. Voss barked, stabbing a finger toward the tail section. That apparatus is not part of the official Army Air Force's inventory. It bears no Boeing certification. It has successfully evaded every mandatory testing protocol. Remove that equipment immediately. Sergeant or I will personally initiate proceedings for your court-martial on charges of willful destruction of government property. Romano's pilot, Lieutenant Holbrook, intervened, stepping forward calmly. Captain, with respect, my tail gunner secured his first confirmed kill utilizing that site today. Perhaps we should investigate. Your opinion is noted, Lieutenant Voss cut in sharply. The modification will be stripped. That decision is absolute and final. News of the confrontation spread through the 91st Bomb Group like an electrical surge. By the time evening mess call sounded, every single gunner on the base was aware of Romano's now infamous illegal mirror sight and his highly successful debut mission. Opinion fractured immediately and violently. Veteran gunners crowded Romano's mess table, peppering him with rapid-fire questions. How complex was the actual fabrication? What was the usable field of view? Could those small mirrors withstand the intense aerodynamic stress? encountered at 200 miles per hour. Conversely, the engineering cadre and the senior maintenance supervisors reacted with profound alarm and professional indignation. Captain Theodore Morrison, the group's assistant armament officer, immediately summoned an emergency conference on October 11th, attended by 14 different officers. The atmosphere in the room was overtly hostile. Gentleman Morrison began attempting to seize control of the narrative. We are currently dealing with a severe breakdown of military discipline. A sergeant has taken it upon himself to execute unauthorized field modifications using scavenged components of entirely unknown origin and provenance. This sets an exceptionally perilous precedent. With the utmost respect, sir, that is patently absurd. Major William Calhoun, the operations officer, interjected, rising to his feet. Romano shot down a fighter using this exact system. If this modification manages to improve our abysmal 8% baseline hit rate by even a small margin, a marginal gain, then Morrison's face tightened in disapproval. Major, we have zero verifiable data. One successful combat engagement does not constitute operational validation for an unvetted system. Then test the damned thing, Calhoun countered sharply. Order Romano to fly the next mission, with the equipment still installed, guns cameras rolling to capture objective empirical data. If the system fails to perform under scrutiny, then we remove it. If it succeeds, perhaps we should be fabricating and installing these sites ourselves, rather than initiating court-martial proceedings against the enlisted man who actually engineered a viable solution. The debate devolved rapidly into shouting, pitting the undeniable safety concerns of the engineers against the desperate need for casualty reduction voiced by the combat leaders. At 8 o'clock that evening, the intractable dispute was escalated to Colonel Stanley Ray, the commanding officer of the 91st Bomb Group. Colonel Ray, a man who had flown as a bomber pilot during the Great War, was a 53-year-old career officer, known for maintaining iron discipline alongside an undeniable streak of pragmatic realism. He listened intently to the heated arguments from both factions for a full 90 minutes, allowing no interruptions. Finally, he spoke, his voice cutting through the tension. "How many of our bombers did this group lose last week?" he asked quietly. Silence descended upon the officers. "Captain Morrison, I specifically requested an answer." 17, Sir Morrison admitted reluctantly. 17 B-17s from this group alone. "And how many enemy fighters did our tail gunners manage to shoot down during the entirety of those missions?" "Confirmed kills, Captain." 3, sir. Ray nodded once slowly. 17 bombers totaling 680 American young men against a confirmed tally of 3 enemy fighters. Your concern regarding unauthorized modifications, Captain, is duly noted. Your adherence to regulations is commendable in principle. But I am currently far more preoccupied with losing 17 goddamn airplanes every 7 days, because our supposed defensive armament demonstrably does not function in combat. He then fixed his gaze directly upon Sergeant Romano. "Sergeant, your innovation remains on your aircraft. You will fly the next 3 scheduled missions with the gun cameras recording every single defensive action. If your confirmed hit rate shows a measurable objective improvement, I will personally authorize group-wide installation of this device. If it fails to meet a higher standard, the equipment will be removed and you will face disciplinary action for the initial violation. Is that clearly understood?" Romano snapped a salute that broke the tension in the room. "Yes, sir." Colonel Ray rose to his feet. "Gentlemen, this meeting is officially adjourned, and someone find me copies of those damned mirror drawings." If this video helped you see the true gritty reality behind official history, do yourself a favor and hit that subscribe button. We are dedicated to unearthing the crucial stories that the sanitized textbooks inevitably omit. For our next deep dive, we will be examining the brilliant radar operator who single-handedly secured a critical element of D-Day success from a cramped basement office in Portsmouth. October 12th, 1943. Staff Sergeant Romano takes flight for his 4th operational mission, the modified sight system firmly in place, the sensitive gun cameras recording every fraction of a second. The 8th Air Force has committed 236 B-17s to strike heavily defended German submarine construction yards. In response, the Luftwaffe scrambles 250 interceptors. At 11:23 hours, just as the bombers cross the German coastline, the coordinated fighter attacks commence. A Focke-Wulf 190 dives aggressively from the 7 o'clock high position. Romano smoothly tracks the enemy through the illuminated crosshairs of the reflector sight, which instantly provides a stable aiming reference point. Simultaneously, his peripheral vision captures the mirrored images showing the alignment of his actual gun barrels. He initiates a sustained 4-second burst, making minute real-time adjustments based on the feedback from the tracer reflections, showing him the true trajectory of his round. The FW-190's outer port wing section bursts into bright destructive flame. The fighter violently disengages, streaming thick black smoke. At 11:47 hours, a Bf-190 peels off from the formation, executing the classic, dreaded 6 o'clock level tail approach. Romano centers the reticle precisely where the fighter is headed, verifies his mirror feedback, and fires. The impact is devastating. The Bf-190's cockpit canopy shatters into a million pieces. The pilot loses control, and the fighter rolls hard, plunging away into a steep dive. The recovered gun camera film provides incontrovertible evidence for both engagements. Romano lands knockout dropper, having logged 2 confirmed kills and 1 additional highly probable kill. His total expenditure for these 3 confirmed aerial victories, 380 rounds. This averages out to an extraordinary 190 rounds expended per confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed. This represented an absolutely monumental improvement over the general average of nearly 2,800 rounds typically expended by conventional tailgunners to achieve a single victory. The technical staff immediately initiated rigorous review of the combat footage. Captain Morrison watched Romano's tracer patterns and observed the target tracking discipline. Even he could no longer logically dispute the evident success. The synergy between the mirror array and the reflector sight permitted instantaneous continuous fire correction that was simply unattainable when relying on the crude ring and bead alignment. Very well, Morrison conceded, finally defeated by the evidence. It functions. However, we require complete standardized engineering blueprints and formalized installation procedures before we can contemplate authorizing deployment across the entire bomb group. How long will that take? Colonel Ray demanded. A minimum of 6 weeks, sir. We must coordinate with 8th Air Force Headquarters, submit exhaustive modification proposals for review and archival. We do not possess 6 weeks, Ray, retorted his voice, dangerously quiet. He turned his attention to Technical Sergeant Kellerman. Sergeant, based on your current capacity and utilizing materials, you can actively scavenge right now. How many of these complete site assemblies can you manufacture daily? Kellerman paused, calculating quickly. With assistance from the sheet metal shop working overtime, perhaps 4 complete assemblies per day. If we prioritize scavenging reflector sites from damaged fighters and manufacture the mirror brackets locally, we can begin production immediately. Do it, Ray commanded. I want every single tail gunner in this entire group equipped with this apparatus within 2 weeks. Sir, without official authorization from 8th Air Force Command, Morrison started to protest. Captain, I will personally manage the liaison with 8th Air Force Command, Ray stated firmly. Your sole responsibility is to finalize the engineering specifications for standardization. Meeting adjourned. What followed was an improvised, frenetic manufacturing campaign that would undoubtedly have caused the highest levels of military procurement bureaucracy to immediately shut down the entire base. Kellerman and his skeletal maintenance crew began systematically cannibalizing components from every corner of Bassingbourn Airfield. Reflector sights were procured from P-47 airframes slated for scrapping. Specialized mirrors were taken from navigation aids damaged beyond repair. Aluminum stock was sourced from unallocated supply caches. They established a makeshift production line within the relative obscurity of the maintenance hangar, churning out 4 complete functional mirror sight systems every single day. By the 20th of October 1943, 18 B-17s belonging to the 91st Bomb Group were secretly flying combat missions, equipped with Romano's modification. The impact on mission statistics was immediate and nothing short of revolutionary. On the October 20th, Duran mission tailgunners flying aircraft outfitted with the mirror-reflector sights achieved an astonishing 11 confirmed kills against a total of 47 fighter attacks engaged. That performance translated directly into a 23.4% confirmed hit rate, nearly 3 times the documented performance of the standard equipment. The pattern persisted. On November 3rd, during the mission targeting Wilhelmshaven, they logged 16 confirmed victories against 68 fighter passes, a phenomenal hit rate of 23.5%. On November 5th, during the mission near Gelsenkirchen, they registered 13 confirmed kills with a success rate of 21.8%. The shift in the raw casualty mathematics was profound, fundamentally altering the calculus of bomber survivability. Luftwaffe fighter pilots, who had grown accustomed to attacking the B-17s from the rear quadrant with near impunity, suddenly found themselves facing accurate, sustained, and highly effective defensive fire. German after-action reports began to reflect this new reality, noting the alarming increase in the lethality of American tail weapons and explicitly recommending substantial revisions to their standard approach tactics. Major Hans-Joachim Marseille's protégé, a highly respected Luftwaffe night fighter, ace, temporarily reassigned to day operations, logged an entry in his personal combat diary: "The flying fortresses have become noticeably more lethal." Their tail gunners are now displaying an accuracy level previously only achievable with expensive, complex power turrets. Attacks originating from the rear hemisphere now carry an unacceptable level of attrition risk. The unprecedented success stories inevitably filtered upward to the command echelon at High Wycombe. On November 18th, Brigadier General Frederick Castle, the commander of the 4th Bombardment Wing, arrived at Bassingbourn unannounced. He personally inspected Romano's cramped tail position, spent significant time analyzing the crucial gun camera footage, and then subjected Sergeant Romano to a rigorous half-hour debriefing interview. Sergeant Castle inquired, a genuine spark of amusement in his voice, "How did you possess the foresight to know this configuration would actually function?" Romano, ever the pragmatist, merely shrugged slightly. "I didn't, sir. But the sights we were issued definitely were not working, so I logically concluded that almost anything else might constitute an improvement." General Castle let out a rare, genuine laugh. "A fair assessment, Sergeant. A very fair assessment." He carefully examined the improvised mirror assembly, testing its range of motion and stability. "This can clearly be manufactured efficiently at depot level. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir," Romano confirmed. "Sergeant Kellerman has already produced formalized engineering sketches, and the components are primarily scavenged, though we could procure proper materials if required by command." Castle nodded decisively. "I am issuing immediate authorization for deployment across the entire 4th Wing. Every B-17 will incorporate this modification within the next 30 days. He looked directly at the young sergeant, his demeanor turning serious. "Sergeant, you have likely saved more American airmen's lives than you will ever have the privilege of knowing personally." By December of 1943, Romano's ingenious device, now formally documented under the bureaucratic designation, the Field Expedient Tailgun Aiming System, Type 1, was installed in over 200 B-17, operating across several bomb groups within the 8th Air Force. The actual 8th Air Force Command commissioned official formal engineering studies. Boeing's Advanced Cheyenne Modification Center, already deeply invested in developing the more sophisticated Cheyenne tail turret, wisely decided to incorporate the proven principles of Romano's reflector sight design directly into their own forthcoming production model. The finalized mass-produced Cheyenne turret, which began appearing on the newest B-17G models starting in January of 1944, featured a night reflector sight mounted in a position that strikingly mirrored the precise location where Romano had placed his salvaged P-47 unit. The measurable outcome on bomber crew longevity was undeniable and statistically significant. For B-17 groups that rapidly adopted these enhanced tail sighting systems, losses attributed to rear quadrant fighter attacks plummeted by approximately 35% between the crucial months of October 1943 and March 1944. That percentage translates into a tangible result: dozens upon dozens of aircraft and literally hundreds of young men survived missions from which they were statistically scheduled to perish. They lived because an enlisted man bypassed the system. Romano continued to fly combat missions until February of 1944. His personal operational tally reached 7 confirmed kills and 4 highly probable aerial victories, a truly exceptional record for any tail gunner. But far more significantly, his ingenious modification didn't just stay within the 8th Air Force. It propagated rapidly to the 15th Air Force operating in the Mediterranean theater, and eventually even influenced the defensive hardware upgrades applied to the B-24 Liberator fleet. On February 22, 1944, during the massive synchronized maximum effort known as Big Week, targeting German aircraft production complexes. Romano's aircraft sustained catastrophic flak damage over Leipzig. He maintained fire against pursuing fighters even as hydraulic fluid and aviation fuel began spraying liberally throughout the confined space of his tail compartment. His bomber managed a perilous crash landing deep inside German-occupied Belgium. The entire crew miraculously survived the landing. Sergeant Romano spent the remainder of the conflict confined within a grim German prisoner of war camp. Michael Romano returned to the United States in May of 1945 frail and weighing only 127 pounds, 18 pounds lighter than his enlistment weight. The Army Air Forces finally acknowledged his contribution, awarding him the Distinguished Flying Cross for extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight, with the citation carefully noting his innovative contribution, defensive armament effectiveness. The official citation naturally chose to meticulously omit the fact that his innovation was for a critical period entirely illegal. Romano never sought the ensuing publicity. He politely declined numerous requests for interviews from official military history journals. When Boeing engineers extended an invitation to their Seattle headquarters to discuss the ongoing Cheyenne turret development, he declined flatly, stating simply, "I only engineered what was absolutely necessary for me to survive." He noted that others had taken his field fix and managed to bureaucratize it into something official. He returned to Pittsburgh, married the girl he met in high school, and spent the next 37 years working diligently as a respected machinist. He seldom spoke of the war. His children grew up knowing only that their father had been a bomber crewman who had assisted in fixing some gun sites. Yet the tangible legacy of his makeshift mirror-reflector system profoundly outlived his personal inclination toward obscurity. The production B-17G Cheyenne tail turret, which incorporated the fundamental sighting principles pioneered by Romano, became standard equipment on virtually every late-model Flying Fortress. Boeing manufactured 8,680 B-17Gs between August 1943 and April 1945. The overwhelming majority equipped with these vastly superior tailgun sighting mechanisms directly traceable back to Romano's initial, unauthorized garage-style modification. This incremental improvement in tailgun efficiency forced the Luftwaffe to fundamentally abandon their preferred deadly 6 o'clock attack vector. German fighter tactics were abruptly shifted toward more dangerous head-on approaches, inherently riskier for the attacking aircraft, but tactically necessary to avoid the newly formidable rear defenses. This forced tactical pivot directly contributed to a measurable increase in Luftwaffe fighter losses throughout the remainder of 1944. Post-war strategic assessment compiled by the authoritative U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey quantified the final impact B-17 groups utilizing the improved tail gun sight technology reported 32 to 37% fewer losses stemming from rear attacks compared to the earlier models across thousands of high-stakes bomber sorties. That percentage represents a concrete reality: approximately 840 aircraft and 8,400 crew members who, statistically speaking, should have been added to the casualty lists, instead returned home safely. The principles Romano first experimented with, the amalgamation of reflector, aiming, peripheral visual feedback, and immediate system response, continue to influence the design philosophy of modern defensive armament systems right up to the complex computing sites found on today's B-52 Stratofortress. In 1983, the 91st Bomb Group Association convened a reunion at Bassingbourn Airfield, now carefully preserved as a historical monument. Several tail gunners who had flown combat missions relying on Romano's simple mirror-reflector sights were in attendance. Among them was Gerald Hammond, who brought with him a single salvaged mirror mounting bracket he had kept wrapped in cloth for 4 long decades. Hammond stood before Romano, now a 60-year-old grandfather with silvering hair, working quietly as a machine repairman, and said simply, "Because of you and those mirrors, Sergeant, I made it home. My children exist today only because you absolutely refused to tolerate lousy gun sights. Thank you." Romano, visibly uncomfortable with such overt emotional acknowledgement, gave a slight shrug and replied, "You would have done the exact same thing, Gerald. We all just wanted to make it back alive, that's all. But that's precisely where Michael Romano was profoundly mistaken. Hundreds of his fellow tail gunners faced the exact same inadequate sighting equipment, the identical impossible firing solutions, and the same terrifying casualty metrics. Only one of them possessed the inner conviction to challenge the entrenched status quo. Only one of them demonstrated the sheer audacity to deliberately contravene established military regulations, the necessary mechanical skill to improvise a functional solution under duress, and the profound moral courage to risk the ultimate sanctioned court-martial for the mere possibility of saving lives. Michael Romano passed away in 2003 at the age of 79. His obituary, published in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, allotted a single terse sentence to his wartime service World War II veteran 8th Air Force. It made absolutely no mention that he had personally saved thousands of men with a handful of salvaged mirrors and scrap aluminum. It failed to note that his initially illegal field modification became the undisputed standard equipment. It failed to record that while high-ranking generals and cautious engineers spent months debating regulations and bureaucratic testing phases, a 22-year-old steel mill worker from Pennsylvania solved the fatal problem they could not. Because ultimately the most consequential innovations are rarely born from waiting for official permission. They are forged by individuals who absolutely refuse to stand idly by and watch good people perish while awaiting bureaucratic approval. Romano's enduring principle remains crystal clear for us today. Sometimes the highest expression of courage is not blindly obeying the established order. It is recognizing the precise moment when the rules cease to matter as much as the lives hanging in the balance. If this story resonated with you, if you believe these forgotten acts of field ingenuity deserve to be seen, please take a moment to smash that like button right now. And more importantly, tell us in the comments below, what's the most critical regulation you think needs to be broken for a greater good? We read every single thought you leave us,